Hey class, we've talked about polar functions and polar coordinates already this the past 2 days, and so we've done section 9.1 where we actually focused on just the polar coordinates where we graphed them out on the polar graph. Then we actually talked about actually graphing out the actual polar equations on the polar graph itself. And so now we're going to work on actually dealing with polar versus rectangular coordinates, going backwards and forwards, be able to change it from polar to rectangular, rectangular to polar. So here, before we actually start everything, remember your rectangular, sorry, let me spell rectangular correctly, that'd be wonderful. Rectangular coordinates are dealing with an xy plane. So we have an x here, axis, and a y-axis here, and it gives us that point xy. And remember our polar, what we've been talking about recently, our polar coordinates deal with our concentric circles that we have, and it still deals with our poles here. But again, each one of these are dealing with our radian or degree measures, and all stemming from these parts here. So we had the whole pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3. And again, everything should be pulling out from the origin there. And then so on and so forth all the way around. And we said here that the rings were the r's. And when it came to these parts here was what our angles were. These are angles here. And so when it came to our actual polar coordinate, it was r theta. And so we're going to have to be able to go back between the two. So first off, before we actually go into everything, let's go ahead and put up the title for this section. So this is section 9.3. And we call this our polar and rectangular. I still spelled rectangular wrong again. Sorry about that. Rectangular coordinates. And by the time we get to the end of it, we'll be able to create rectangular equations and everything of that sort too. To go from rectangular to polar and polar to rectangular. So we're going to deal with all of that in this section. So here, as we continue on, the first preliminary information before we get to our first example, we are converting polar coordinates. First off, the first thing we're going to do is converting polar coordinates to rectangular coordinates. So we go from polar to rectangular. And again, as we wrote up top, our rectangular are xy. And our polar are r theta. And that is coordinates here. All right, so with these, we're going to have to be able to go backwards and forwards between them. So with it, again, we're going from polar to rectangular at this point. Our polar means that we're going to have an r in it and a theta. Our rectangular means we're going to have x and y. So if we're going to change these to x and y's, that means we're going to use these two formulas. So x equals r cosine theta, and y equals r sine theta. And that should remind you of something that we talked about before. When we talked about our unit circle, we talked about our trig functions and everything originally. We said that y was equal to sine, and x is equal to cosine. So we didn't really change anything. Only thing we added extra was just the r here. So, but x is still cosine, y is still sine. So when we deal with all these parts, don't forget that r is cosine, x is cosine, y is sine. X cosine, y is sine. All right, so now we're going to go into an actual example where we deal with changing it from rectangular coordinates to polar, and then we'll go backwards from polar to rectangular. So it's going to be pretty easy. All right, so let's do this.